The Great Depression. The Depression of the 1930s came to a shock to Americans worldwide who went through the positivity of the 1920s had. The consumer revolution of that earlier decade had created positivity that American life would improve in all aspects. But the collapse of the stock market in the late 1929, factories closed, machines fell silent, and millions of Americans walked the streets looking for jobs that they didn't have room for. The effects of the Great Depression. Men and women ended up living in lean-tos made of scrap wood and metal, and families went without meat and fresh vegetables for months, existing on an appetite of soup and beans. Americans suffered years of poverty. Unemployed stood in lines for hours waiting for relief checks. Veterans sold apples or pencils on street corners, and people left the city for the countryside but found no salvation on the farm life. Crops rotted in the fields because prices were too low to make harvesting worth it. Sheriffs had to fend off angry people because banks were foreclosing long overdue mortgages from farms. African Americans that left poverty of the South for factory jobs in the North were one of the first to be laid off. Nearly 500,000 Mexicans were deported in the 1930s, including their families and even their children that were born in the U.S. People with poverty knew how to survive the cold winters. They patched their shoes with pieces of rubbers from discarded tires. They heated only the kitchens of their house and ate scraps of other people's food. The middle class was hit hard too. Professionals and white-collar workers wouldn't ask for help because they thought they would be looked down upon. One New York dentist and his wife turned on the gas in their house and left a note saying, "We want to get out of the way before we are forced to accept relief money. If you fall behind on your payments, they'll close your house and you'll face eviction." Healthcare declined, which forced many people to stop going to the doctors and dentists. Men, boys, and women rode the railroads in search of jobs. The Great Depression lasted from 1929 to 1939 and was the worst economic downturn in history of the industrialized world. This began after the stock market crash of October 1929, which sent Wall Street into a panic and wiped out millions of investors. Over 10 years, consumer spending and investment dropped, causing declines in industrial and employment as companies laid off workers. In 1933, the Great Depression reached its lowest point. Around 15 million Americans were unemployed, as many banks had failed. By 1933, unemployment had risen from 3% to a high of 25% of the nation's workforces. Wages fell even worse to 42%. Many workers were being laid off or their wages were cut more than in half. Government leaders passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff to protect domestic industries and jobs. World trade plummeted to 65%, and the Dust Bowl hit the Midwest. For fighting the Depression, Herbert Hoover was the Great Depression's biggest victim. When the downfall hit in 1929, he tried to rally the nation with bold forecasts of better days ahead. This gave the people mistrust in him. Hoover rejected proposals from strong government actions. He called on private charities and local government to help feed and clothe those in need. Taxes were cut rapidly. He proposed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, in 1932. This corporation loaned government money to financial institutions to save them from bankruptcy. Hoover failed to dig the U.S. out of the Great Depression. He ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the Bonus Army. The Bonus Army in June 1932 was a group of 20,000 World War I veterans marching on the Washington, D.C. to demand an immediate payment of their adjusted compensation. compensation. Bonuses voted by Congress in 1924. Congress rejected their demands, and President Hoover, fearing that their ranks were infested with criminals and radicals, had them removed from the encampment. Public relations disaster for Hoover. Nation's banking structure was coming to a collapse. Bank failings started to rise in 1931 and in 1932 as customers responded to rumors of bankruptcy by rushing in to withdraw their deposits. Many Americans were ready for new leadership in the White House. So, the causes of the Great Depression. According to Ben Bernanke, the past chairman of the Federal Reserve, the central bank helped create the Depression. Bernanke highlighted the Fed's 5 critical mistakes. One being the Fed began raising the federal funds rate in the spring of 1928. It kept increasing it through a recession that started in August 1929. The second mistake is when the stock market crashed, investors turned to the currency markets. At that time, the gold standard supported the value of the dollars held by the U.S. government. The third mistake, the Federal raised interest rates again to preserve the dollar value. More bankruptcies followed after this. The fourth mistake was the Fed didn't increase the supply of money to combat deflation. The fifth mistake is investors withdrew all their deposits from banks. The failure of the banks created more panic. The Feds ignored the banks' situation, destroyed any consumers' remaining confidence in financial institutions. Money supply decreased. Supply of the U.S. dollars fell by 30%. The end of the Great Depression. In 1932, the country elected Franklin D. Roosevelt as the president. Franklin D. Roosevelt, also known as FDR, was an American statesman and political leader who served as the 32nd president of the United States from 1933 until his death in 1945. He promised to create federal government programs to end the Great Depression. With 100 days, he signed the New Deal into law. This created 42 agencies. This was designed to create jobs, allow unionization, and provide unemployment insurance. This includes Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This helped safeguard the economy and prevent another depression. Another big thing that happened during the Depression was the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was a drought and soil erosion brought on by overfarming that turned the agriculture land of the Great Plains into a giant dust bowl during the 1930s. This happened from farmers fixing their crops and trying to plant new ones by running over the sand on top. This hit western Kansas, Oklahoma, eastern Colorado, and the Texas Panhandle. Farmers abandoned their land because many deaths arose from the Dust Bowl. FDR and the New Deal. Americans wanted new leadership in the White House. This is where FDR comes into play. He was born in an old Dutch colonial aristocracy of New York. He is also a distant cousin of Teddy Roosevelt. He grew up with advantages, wealth, to his own private tutors, own sailboat, ponies, traveling around the world into Europe, and education at Groton and Harvard. He attended law school but left to pursue politics. He served in the New York legislation and then went to Washington as an assistant secretary of the Navy under Wilson. He was defeated as the Democratic vice president candidate in 1920. He just began a baking career when he suffered an attack of polio in the summer of 1921. He never walked again unaided. He re-entered politics in the mid-1920s and was elected governor of New York in 1928. He was a master of persuading and convincing other people. He possessed a radiant voice, deep and rich, a great smile and confidence. His polio gave people the understanding of human suffering and a political appeal as a man who faces many odds and challenges and has overcome them along the way. Roosevelt took advantage of the opportunity offered by the Great Depression. He captured the two uses of the divided Democrats, appealing to both the traditionalists from the South and the West and the new urban elements in the North. After winning the party's nomination in 1932, he flew to Chicago and told delegates, I pledge you myself to a New Deal for the American people. The election of 1932. In the fall, he defeated Herbert Hoover in a landslide for the Democrats. He tallied 472 electoral votes, sweeping the South and the West and nearing all the large industrial states. Farmers, workers, Protestants, Catholics, immigrants, and native-born rallied behind FDR because he promised to restore the prosper in America. The 100 Days. FDR took office on March 4th, 1933. The economy was on brink of collapse. Unemployment at 13 million, 1/4 of the labor force. Banks closed in 38 states. He said he would call Congress into special session and request broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. The next 10 days, FDR won his first Great New Deal victory by saving the nation's banks. On March 5th, he issued closing the banks and called Congress back into a session. He drafted new banking legislation and presented it March 9th. Few hours later, both houses passed it. On March 12th, FDR addresses the nation by radio in the first of his fireside chats. Fireside chats are radio addressing by President FDR from 1933 to 1944. He spoke to the American people about issues as the banking crisis, Social Security, and World War II. Many banks opened up quick. Instead of nationalizing the banks, he put government resources behind the banks and presented private ownership. During these 100 days, Roosevelt sent 15 major requests to Congress and deceived back 15 pieces of legislation. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, is a New Deal effort at regional planning created by Congress in 1933. This agency built dams and power plants on the Tennessee River. It programs for flood control, soil conservation, and reforestation, and helped raise the standard of living for millions in the Tennessee River Valley.